Mist settles over the Danish countryside like a veil, softening the edges of the fields and swallowing the horizon. Beneath that mist lie shapes that do not belong to nature. From the ground, they appear as shallow ridges, arcs of earth rising just enough to catch the morning light. But from above, when the eye can stretch across the whole, they reveal themselves for what they are: circles, vast and deliberate, traced onto the land with a hand that understood both geometry and power. These circles are not marks of accident. They are Viking ring forts, some of the most mysterious monuments left behind by the Norse world. At first glance, they are simple. A circular rampart. 4 gates, set like the points of a compass. Inside, the faint shadows of wooden houses once stood, arranged in strict quadrants. The design repeats across multiple sites: Trelleborg, Furkert, Nonnebakken, Aggersborg, Borgring. Each name carries the weight of a place where something extraordinary once happened, though the details remain beyond our reach. What we see today are only remnants: grassy banks where ramparts stood, post holes marking the outlines of halls, ditches that once held sharpened stakes or wooden palisades. Yet even in ruin, the forts speak of ambition. They are the work of a society capable of large-scale planning, of mobilizing labor and resources, of imposing order on the landscape itself. And that is what makes them so puzzling. These were not crude strongholds thrown together in haste to fend off attackers. Their construction demanded vision. The ramparts were carefully measured, their interiors laid out with precision rarely matched in the Viking world. The speed of their building suggests central authority, a king or ruler powerful enough to command men, timber, and time. Everything about them shouts intent. Yet what that intent was remains shrouded. Were they built as military bases, designed to house warriors and protect trade routes? Were they administrative centers, early experiments in royal bureaucracy? Were they ritual arenas, where the geometry of the circle itself carried meaning tied to myth and cosmology? The forts contain hints of all of these roles, and yet they fully answer none of them. The strangeness grows deeper when we consider their lifespan. Most appear to have been used only briefly. Archaeology shows little sign of long-term occupation. The houses inside them were not rebuilt again and again as in living towns. Instead, many forts fell into disuse within a generation. Some bear marks of fire, gates burned and ramparts scarred. Others were simply abandoned, left to sink back into the earth. Why create something so monumental, only to let it slip away so soon? The silence of their abandonment is almost as mysterious as their construction. The popular image of the Viking Age does not prepare us for this kind of riddle. We are taught to think of Vikings as wild raiders, sudden storms on foreign shores, living in scattered farmsteads and longhouses, bound more by blood than by law. Yet here stand monuments that suggest something else entirely: order, discipline, planning on a scale that feels closer to Rome than to raiding parties. To walk the earthworks of Trelleborg or stand at the gates of Furkert is to confront a contradiction. These forts refuse to fit neatly into the Viking story we think we know. Imagine standing at the entrance of one of these ring forts 1,000 years ago. The rampart rises above you, timber and earth towering in a perfect arc. The gate aligns with the rising sun, light spilling through in a straight line to the opposite side. Inside, the houses stand in clean rows, their doors facing inward toward the central crossroad. The place feels more like a planned city than a warrior's camp. Every angle, every distance, has been calculated. To step inside is to step into geometry made flesh. And yet it is not sterile. Fires would have burned, smoke curling upward. Horses might have been tethered along the rampart. Children would have run between the houses. Warriors, farmers, priests, all might have passed through, their footsteps echoing off the packed earth. But for what purpose? Was it training for conquest? A stage for royal power? A ritual demonstration meant to impress both gods and men? Archaeologists continue to wrestle with these questions. Excavations reveal traces of weapons and tools, but never in quantities that confirm a purely military role. Animal bones and domestic items suggest feasting and ritual, but not enough to prove that religion alone explains the forts. The evidence points in many directions, yet refuses to settle on one. Each new discovery sharpens the picture while deepening the mystery. The forts endure as puzzles because they embody something rare, ambition without clear explanation. They show us Vikings not as we imagine them, chaotic marauders, but as builders of monuments that require a different kind of respect. These ring fortresses demand we think of the Norse as capable of statecraft, of imposing their will on the land in forms that were meant to last. And yet, lasting was not what they did. Their existence is brief, their purpose clouded, their legacy uncertain. Even so, the earth remembers. Stand at Aggersborg, the largest of them all, and you feel the scale. Its ramparts enclose a space so vast that whole armies could have gathered within. From its gates, you can see the waters of the Limfjord glittering in the distance, a vital passage through Denmark. The placement was no accident. Whoever built this fortress understood both the landscape and the flow of power across it. From here, they could control movement, trade, war. And yet, for all that potential, the site does not tell us if such control was ever exercised. It remains a stage without a recorded play, an arena whose performance we can only guess at. That is the essence of the mystery. These forts show us a Viking world more complex than legend allows. A world where kings could command vast projects, where geometry and power met, where order rose out of the earth in perfect circles. But they also show us silence. They speak in riddles, their voices half buried in soil, their meaning withheld. We can measure their ramparts, count their houses, date their timbers, but we cannot yet answer the simplest question: why? And perhaps that is why they remain so compelling. Their mystery is not a flaw, but their greatest power. They remind us that the past is not a solved puzzle, but an endless one, each answer leading to another question. As the sun sets over the quiet fields, the ring forts hold their silence, and we are left standing at their gates, asking again and again what the builders themselves once knew but never wrote down. For centuries the ring forts lay hidden, softened by grass and silence, their lines invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Farmers ploughed fields above them, shepherds led flocks across their ramparts, and villages grew nearby, unaware of what lay beneath. Only with the curiosity of antiquarians in the 19th century did the earth begin to yield its secret. In 1850, at Trelleborg on Zealand, the first clear traces were recognized. What seemed to be an ordinary hillock revealed a perfect arc once the soil was cut. The shape was too deliberate. Men with shovels uncovered ditches and post holes, and soon it was clear that something vast had been raised here long before their time. The early excavators worked without the careful methods of modern archaeology. They dug quickly, recording little, driven by the thrill of revelation. Even so, they were awed. The ramparts formed a circle so regular that some thought it must be a Roman relic, impossible for Vikings to have achieved. Their assumptions revealed more about 19th century prejudice than about the Norse. In an age when Vikings were remembered as wild raiders, the idea that they had mastered geometry and large-scale engineering seemed implausible. Yet the soil refused to lie. Every trench confirmed the precision of the design. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, more sites came to light. At Firket in Jutland, another circle emerged, smaller but just as exact. Nonnebakken near Odense revealed its outline beneath a modern city. Aggersborg appeared on the banks of the Limfjord, immense in scale, dwarfing the others. Each new discovery deepened the mystery. The forts were not isolated anomalies. They were a pattern, repeated across Denmark with uncanny similarity. Something deliberate tied them together. The excitement of these finds was tempered by confusion. What were these places? The ramparts were strong, but evidence of siege or battle was lacking. The post holes revealed longhouses, yet the pattern of occupation seemed brief. Treasure was absent, graves were few, and the usual marks of thriving communities were missing. Instead, the forts appeared almost theatrical, as though built for a role they never fully performed. Scholars debated endlessly. Some saw them as fortresses, others as camps, still others as royal manors or cult sites. The lack of consensus became part of the legend. By the mid-20th century, new techniques brought sharper answers. Careful stratigraphy, carbon dating, and aerial photography allowed archaeologists to see what earlier generations could not. From the sky, the outlines of the forts blazed into view, circles and crossroads drawn across farmland with the precision of an architect's pen. Aerial surveys confirmed what trench after trench suggested. The forts were not piecemeal constructions but planned projects, built rapidly, perhaps within a single campaign of labor. Their timber posts, when dated, pointed consistently to the reign of Harold Bluetooth in the late 10th century. Suddenly, the forts had a likely author, a king known for uniting Denmark and embracing Christianity, a ruler with both the motive and the means to leave such marks upon the land. Still, even with clearer dates, the purpose remained elusive. Excavations at Firket uncovered a rich female grave, the so-called sorceress with her staff and strange amulets, suggesting ritual importance alongside military function. At Trelleborg, archaeologists found rows of longhouses aligned so rigidly that they seemed designed less for comfort than for display. At Aggersborg, the largest of all, the sheer size defied easy explanation. Could so many warriors have been housed here? Or was it intended to intimidate by its scale rather than by actual occupation? Each site offered clues, but never a final answer. As the spades turned earth, another puzzle emerged. The forts showed signs of deliberate abandonment. Ramparts collapsed without repair. Gates were burned and left unrestored. Houses fell into ruin after only a few decades. This was not the slow fading of ordinary settlements, but the sudden silencing of monuments. Why? Did political shifts make them obsolete? Did new threats render them impractical? Or were they always meant as temporary statements of authority, built to impress in the moment rather than endure through time? The soil whispered possibilities, but withheld certainty. The more that was uncovered, the more the forts resisted easy categorization. They refused to be pinned down as merely military, merely administrative, or merely ritual. They seemed to contain aspects of all three. Their design suggested defense, their placement hinted at control of trade, their graves and finds implied ceremony. They stood at the crossroads of functions, much like their own inner roads crossing at the center of the circle. Perhaps that was the point. They were not one thing but many layered symbols of a society in transition, half pagan and half Christian, half tribal and half royal. Even now, standing on the excavated ramparts of Trelleborg or gazing across the vast enclosure of Aggersborg, you feel both clarity and confusion. The earthworks are undeniable. The geometry is precise. The labor invested is staggering, but the meaning remains out of reach. Every trench cut into the soil brings us closer to the builders, yet the voices of those who raised the forts are lost. What we know comes from bones, post holes, broken tools, and charred timbers, the mute remains of a grand plan that ended in silence. The first glimpses of the forts were revelations, but not answers. They proved that the Vikings were more than raiders, that they could shape landscapes with vision and order. They showed that kings like Harold Bluetooth could command resources on a scale unimagined before. Yet they also taught us humility. The forts stand as reminders that the past does not yield its secrets easily. We can uncover their outlines, measure their ditches, reconstruct their halls, and still stand baffled. They are enigmas carved into the earth, visible and invisible at once, whispering of power, ambition, and mystery. And with each spadeful of soil turned, we are reminded that discovery is not the same as understanding. The ring forts were not casual works of defense. They were monuments of calculation, raised with such order that even today they look less like products of the Viking Age and more like blueprints come to life. To stand on their ramparts is to feel the weight of deliberate geometry, a vision carried out with such discipline that it leaves no doubt about the intent to impress. These were not haphazard walls thrown up in panic. They were constructed with the precision of an architect's dream and the authority of a ruler who could command obedience across a kingdom. Each fortress followed the same remarkable plan. The ramparts rose in a perfect circle, massive earthworks faced with timber, their lines unwavering no matter the ground beneath. 4 gates pierced the walls, aligned exactly to the cardinal points of north, south, east, and west. From each gate, a road ran straight to the center, dividing the interior into 4 equal quadrants. Within each quadrant, long houses stood in disciplined rows, their doorways turned toward the central cross. No house strayed from its allotted place. No corner failed the symmetry. It was order imposed on a scale that leaves no room for coincidence. The very act of shaping earth into circles of such size demanded extraordinary effort. At Aggersborg, the largest, the ramparts enclosed more than 40 acres. Tens of thousands of tons of soil had to be shifted and packed, timber felled and cut, ditches dug with unwavering precision. Even the smaller forts, like Firket, required immense labor. Modern archaeologists estimate that the construction of a single ring fort might have required the work of thousands of men over a single season, coordinated in a feat of logistics equal to any campaign of war. Such labor was not the work of scattered farmers. It required command, resources, and vision at a royal level. The symmetry of the forts is more than an aesthetic choice. It suggests not just discipline but ideology. The circle carries meaning in nearly every culture, a shape without beginning or end, symbol of completeness and order. To impose that form upon the land was to create more than a fortress. It was to create a statement of power shaped into the earth itself. The gates aligned with the compass suggest a consciousness of cosmic order, perhaps linking the forts not only to defense but to ritual, binding human authority to the rhythms of the world. Whether by intent or instinct, the builders set their power within a frame that spoke of universality. The houses inside deepen the mystery. Each longhouse followed standard measurements, built to similar dimensions, their arrangement forming a grid more rigid than any ordinary settlement. Yet when excavated, they reveal little of daily life. Traces of occupation exist, hearths, tools, animal bones, but they are faint, brief, as though these homes were never meant for long-term living. They look more like barracks, or perhaps stages for gatherings, their uniformity emphasizing collective order over individual comfort. If they were military, they speak of an army drilled not only in fighting but in discipline. If they were ceremonial, They suggest gatherings where uniformity itself was part of the performance. The ramparts themselves reveal careful engineering. Beneath their grassy curves lie layers of earth and timber, meticulously packed to hold against both weather and time. In some cases, stone was used to strengthen the base. The ditches dug outside the walls were not merely obstacles, but part of the design, creating impressions of depth and height that amplified the visual effect of the rampart's bulk. These forts were built not just to function but to be seen, their massive circles visible from afar, broadcasting power across the land. The speed with which they appear to have been built adds another layer of marvel. Evidence suggests that each was raised in a single campaign of construction, not pieced together over years. Timber from different sites shows similar felling dates, implying coordination on a kingdom-wide scale. Imagine the message this sent. In a single season, entire landscapes reshaped, perfect circles emerging from the earth as if drawn by some giant hand. The suddenness of their creation must have been as shocking to contemporaries as their perfection is to us. To build so swiftly required not only manpower but resources. Timber had to be harvested in vast quantities, tools fashioned, food provided for workers. Roads and rivers carried supplies to the sites. Each fort was a logistical operation as complex as a military campaign. That such projects could be carried out at all speaks of a level of organization in Viking society often underestimated. These were not loose bands of raiders, but communities capable of centralized effort, directed by a king with both vision and power to enforce it. Standing on the ramparts of Borgring, the most recently discovered of the forts, one can trace the lines of this design even in ruin. The gates face the compass points with uncanny accuracy, the roads meet at the center like the spokes of a wheel, and the houses, though long gone, leave their shadows in the soil. It is impossible not to feel the deliberate mind behind it all. Every angle, every measurement, speaks of intent. This was architecture as propaganda, engineering as declaration. And yet, for all their order, the forts remain mute. They show us what the Vikings could build, but not why. They reveal a society capable of discipline and coordination, but not the exact purpose such discipline served. They are both marvel and enigma, earthworks that speak of vision, power, and precision, yet withhold the reason they were made. The engineering astonishes, but the meaning eludes. That tension is what gives the ring forts their enduring fascination. They are monuments to a past that refuses to fit into easy categories, evidence of genius without clear explanation, circles of earth that still command awe centuries after their builders have vanished. Behind the perfect circles of earth and timber stands a shadowy figure, a man whose name has reached us across the centuries carved in stone and whispered in sagas. Harald Bluetooth, King of Denmark, son of Gorm the Old and Thyra, the ruler who claimed to have united a kingdom and brought Christianity to its people. The ring forts appear in the archaeological record with a suddenness that matches his reign, their timber dating falling squarely within his time. To speak of these great circles without speaking of Harald is almost impossible, for the forts look like the signature of a king who wished to be remembered. Harald is not just a figure of Danish legend. His name is etched into the great Jelling stone, where he boasts of making Denmark Christian and uniting its lands. The stone itself, often called Denmark's birth certificate, stands as a monument to ambition and vision. It seems no coincidence that the same man who raised this monument in stone may also have raised monuments in earth across his kingdom. If Harald sought to transform Denmark from a patchwork of tribes into a unified realm, then the ring forts may have been his tools, symbols hammered into the landscape to show that a new order had arrived. Consider what it meant to rule in the 10th century. Kingship was fragile, authority contested, alliances uncertain. Power had to be demonstrated, not assumed. A king could not merely claim control. He had to show it in ways that could not be ignored. Armies might be loyal one day and vanish the next. Wealth could be won and lost in raids. But to shape the land itself, to leave behind structures so large and precise, was to speak in a language that endured. The ring forts could be seen as Harald's way of writing his authority across the soil of Denmark, binding his people into circles as perfectly ordered as the compass itself. There are hints in history that this interpretation holds weight. Harald faced challenges to his rule, both from within and from abroad. His conversion to Christianity was not a quiet affair, but a political gamble, aligning him with powerful neighbors, but also angering traditionalists. To cement his rule, he needed not only military strength, but visible monuments of control. The forts, raised in key locations near waterways, trade routes, and strategic crossings, would have sent a clear message. The king's hand reaches here, and here, and here. No region lay beyond his authority. The alignment of the forts with Harald's reign also reflects the scale of his ambition. No earlier Danish ruler is associated with such grand projects. The sudden burst of construction, the uniformity of design, and the swift abandonment all suggest a program driven by one will. Harald emerges as the most likely force behind them, a king not content to rule from a hall, but determined to stamp his vision onto the land itself. Each circle becomes a reflection of his crown, each rampart a proclamation of his power. And yet Harald's story, like the forts, is marked by ambiguity. His reign ended in rebellion, his son Sweyn Forkbeard rising against him. Accounts suggest Harald died in exile, a king who once claimed to unite a people cast out by his own blood. The forts, too, bear the mark of brevity. Many were abandoned within years of their construction, left to crumble as power shifted. It is tempting to see in this parallel the arc of Harald's life itself: grand ambition, sudden realization, swift decline. The forts may be less monuments of enduring rule than echoes of a moment when one man sought to impose unity on a world resistant to it. The link between Harald and the forts is strengthened by the broader currents of his time. Across Europe, kings and emperors raised fortifications to secure their realms. Charlemagne had built fortresses along frontiers, imposing order through walls and towers. Harald may have been inspired by these continental models, adapting them into his own cultural context. Where Carolingian forts were rectangular, Harald's were circles, a shape that carried both symbolic and practical power. To choose the circle may have been to claim a different identity, one rooted in both Norse tradition and new ideas of kingship. Walking the ramparts of Furkut or Aggersborg, one can imagine Harald himself surveying the work. A king wrapped in a cloak, flanked by retainers, watching as laborers haul timber, as ramparts rise, as geometry takes form. He would have known the message these forts carried, both to his subjects and to his enemies. To his people, they spoke of protection, order, and the reach of his rule. To rivals, they warned of a kingdom organized and disciplined, not a land of scattered farms easily divided. In both cases, the forts amplified Harald's voice, projecting his authority far beyond his hall. Even now, Harald's presence lingers in these circles. His name has been given new life in modern times, borrowed by technology that unites devices just as he once claimed to unite Denmark. But his true legacy may lie in these earthworks, the mute testimony of his ambition. They remain as puzzles because Harald himself remains a puzzle, a king of vision and contradiction, builder and exile, Christian and pagan, unifier and outcast. The forts mirror their maker, precise in shape yet elusive in meaning, bold in design yet fragile in endurance. To study them is to study him, to trace the outline of his reign in the soil itself. Each rampart is a whisper of his command, each gate a doorway into his world. Harald Bluetooth stands behind the ring forts, not as a ghost of legend, but as a ruler who sought to carve power into the earth, who dreamed of unity and left behind circles that still confound us. His hand is gone, his throne overturned, but his circles remain, reminders that kingship is written not only in blood and stone but also in the very shape of the land. When archaeologists first uncovered the outlines of the ring forts, the question that rose almost immediately was simple but impossible to shake. Who exactly lived inside these great circles? The houses are there, arranged with perfect regularity, their post holes still marking the earth in neat rows. The central roads cross like the arms of a compass, and each quadrant holds its equal share of buildings. At first glance, the layout seems obvious. This was a place where people lived. And yet the deeper one looks, the less certain that answer becomes. The evidence of daily life is surprisingly faint. In normal settlements from the Viking age, the ground is thick with signs of habitation, fragments of pottery, discarded tools, food waste, the remains of fires burned day after day. But inside the ring forts, the soil tells a different story. There are hearths, yes, but not many. There are traces of meals cooked, but only in small amounts. The rubbish one expects from decades of living never appears in abundance. It is as if the houses were occupied only briefly, or only for very specific occasions, and then left empty. They do not feel like family homes, but something else entirely. This has led many to imagine them as military camps, barracks for an army that answered directly to the king. The symmetry of the design would have suited such a purpose well. Each longhouse could hold a group of warriors, their positions mapped out in advance, their movements easy to organize within the grid. The roads leading to the gates would have allowed troops to pour out in any direction, ready to meet an enemy or march in formation. The uniformity of the houses suggests equality among their occupants, not the varied dwellings of farmers or merchants, but the standard quarters of soldiers. And yet, if they were strictly military, why is there not more evidence of battle? The ramparts are strong, but few signs of combat scar the sites. Weapons have been found, but not in the numbers one might expect from permanent garrisons. There are no great burial grounds nearby filled with slain warriors. The forts look ready for war, but strangely untouched by it. They could have been staging grounds, used briefly in campaigns, then abandoned when the threat passed. Or perhaps they were training camps, places where discipline was drilled into warriors before they returned to other duties. The silence of the soil makes it impossible to know for certain. Others have suggested that the forts were not simply about armies, but about settlers. Could they have housed loyal families, brought together by Harold to form new communities under his direct control? The circle, with its ordered layout, might have been intended as a model town, a new way of organizing society. Each quadrant could have represented a group tied to the king: farmers, craftsmen, retainers, living under his watchful eye. Yet the lack of deep household debris again challenges this view. Families leave traces: children's bones, weaving tools, broken pots, and these traces are rare. It is hard to see the forts as towns in the usual sense. Another theory imagines the forts as temporary gathering places, meant to be filled not year-round but seasonally or in times of need. Perhaps when Harold summoned his people for war, for rituals, or for lawmaking, they assembled here. The longhouses could shelter them for the duration, the order of the circle giving structure to the gathering. Then, when the event ended, the people dispersed back to their farms, leaving the forts quiet once more. This would explain both the scale of the construction and the lightness of occupation. They were stages more than settlements, theatres where the drama of kingship played out. The truth may lie in a blend of these roles. The forts could have shifted purpose depending on the moment: military bases when danger loomed, royal camps when the king travelled, assembly sites for great gatherings, even storage depots for food and tribute. Their design was flexible enough to allow all these uses, their symbolism strong enough to support both power and community. What is clear is that they were not ordinary villages. They were built with an intent that went far beyond the needs of daily farming life. The debate between soldiers and settlers reflects the wider mystery of Viking society itself. Too often, the image of Vikings is flattened into raiders and warriors, but the forts remind us that they were also builders, planners, and organizers. They hint at a society where kingship could mobilize thousands, where military and civilian life blurred into each other, and where the lines between war camp, village, and sacred site were not as firm as we might imagine. To ask whether the forts were for soldiers or settlers may even be the wrong question. Perhaps they were for both, or for neither, serving instead as embodiments of a king's vision rather than simple homes or barracks. Walking among the traces today, the emptiness speaks louder than presence. The longhouses are shadows on the ground, their doorways opening toward a center that once pulsed with life but now holds only grass. The ramparts curve in silence, enclosing a void where certainty slips away. Soldiers or settlers, warriors or families, the people who walked these roads have vanished, leaving us only the geometry of their world. It is a geometry that refuses to answer, one that holds its secret tightly, allowing us only glimpses. The forts stand as echoes of lives half seen, figures who marched or feasted or prayed here, their stories swallowed by time, their roles unresolved. When people first look at the great circles of the Viking forts, it is easy to see them as pure instruments of war. Their tall ramparts, their deep ditches, their 4 gates facing the compass points all suggest fortification, defense, the readiness for battle. And yet, as more soil has been sifted, more timbers measured, more patterns traced, the question has grown heavier. Were these places built only for fighting, or did they carry meanings that touched the sacred as well as the practical? In the Viking world, war and ritual were never far apart. The same sword that defended a home could be sacrificed in a bog. The same hall where warriors drank mead could host a feast for the gods. To separate one from the other may be to miss what the circle was truly saying. The design itself begs this question. The strict geometry of the forts is almost unnerving in its perfection. Vikings were skilled builders, but they did not normally leave behind shapes so exact. Longhouses curved and bent with the land. Villages grew unevenly, following the needs of families rather than the dictates of symmetry. To suddenly find circles of earth drawn as if by compass, with houses lined up like spokes in a wheel, feels different. It feels intentional in a way that goes beyond military necessity. Armies do not need perfection. They need speed and strength. Yet here we find beauty married to function, order imposed where chaos would have sufficed. The circle may not just be a wall, but a symbol. In Norse myth, circles carried weight. Sacred sites were often marked by ring shapes, places where the divine could be called down. Stone circles stood across Scandinavia long before the Viking Age, and many of them were used for ceremonies, assemblies, or offerings. The fort circles may have echoed this tradition, recasting an ancient sacred shape into a new royal language. By raising a perfect ring of timber and earth, Harold might have been creating not just a fortress but a ritual space, a circle in which the old gods could be honored or the new Christian god proclaimed. The layout could be a blending of power and piety, defense and devotion. The gates, too, hold meaning, for openings aligned to the north, south, east, and west do more than allow passage. They point to the cardinal directions, the structure of the cosmos itself. In many cultures, such alignment is tied to ritual, mapping the earth onto the heavens, grounding human life in the order of the stars. If the forts were simply military, why take such care? A single gate or two would have been easier to defend. But 4 equal gates, balanced like the arms of a cross or the points of the world, suggest symbolism at work. Standing in the center, one could look outward and see the world framed in equal quarters, as if the circle contained not just soldiers but the universe itself. Inside, the longhouses form neat rows, each alike, each facing the roads that meet in the center. This uniformity could reflect military order, yes, but it could also reflect ritual equality. Imagine gatherings where groups entered through the four gates, each assigned to a quadrant, each house a place of belonging. The very structure could have organized feasts, assemblies, or sacrifices, giving shape to collective acts of devotion. It would not be the first time in history that a fortress doubled as a temple, nor the last. Human beings often shape the same spaces for both fear and faith. The soil itself offers clues, though faint ones. At some forts, archaeologists have found bones of animals that appear to have been sacrificed. There are traces of fires that seem too large for simple cooking, as if great communal flames once burned there. And while evidence is sparse, the very absence of ordinary household debris may point toward ritual use. If these were not lived-in spaces, they may have been ceremonial ones, filled only at certain times, then emptied again. Like a church or a festival ground, they could have sprung to life on special days, only to return to silence when the rites were done. This does not mean warfare was absent. On the contrary, in the Viking mind, ritual and battle were intertwined. Warriors swore oaths before gods, carried amulets for protection, believed their fates woven by unseen hands. A fortress could be both a barracks and a temple, both a defense against enemies and a place where oaths were spoken over fire and blood. To separate one from the other may impose a modern logic onto a world that did not know such clear lines. For Harold and his people, building a circle of earth may have been an act of politics, piety, and preparation for war all at once. Standing at Aggersborg, the largest of the ring forts, one can feel this ambiguity in the air. The ramparts rise in a vast sweep, enclosing space that seems too grand to be mere barracks. In the center, the wind turns in the open grass, and the sky opens wide above. One can imagine warriors drilling in formation, but one can also imagine a king presiding over a rite, sacrifices laid upon the ground, fires rising to the gods. The circle allows both visions, and perhaps both were true at different moments. The forts, in their silence, refuse to choose. They stand between ritual and warfare, between sacred and profane. They remind us that for the Vikings, battle was never just about steel, and faith was never just about prayer. Each act was layered with meaning, each place charged with more than one purpose. To call the ring forts either ritual sites or military camps is to cut away half their power. They are both, and more, mirrors of a world where life and death, war and worship, king and god all mingled within the same circle of earth. One of the strangest facts about the Viking ring forts is not how they were built, nor even why, but how briefly they were used. When archaeologists first began digging, they expected to find the signs of long life, layers of occupation, rebuilding of houses, repairs to ramparts, the slow accumulation of debris that marks decades of habitation. Instead, they found almost the opposite. The forts seemed to have flared into existence, lived for a short span of years, and then fallen silent. It is as if enormous effort was poured into raising them, only for that effort to be abandoned almost as quickly as it began. For monuments so grand, their lives feel unervingly short, and this raises a question as haunting as any. Why build something so vast, only to let it go? The archaeological record speaks clearly about this brevity. The timber used for the ramparts and the houses can be dated through tree rings, and again the results show the same thing. These forts were built in a narrow window of time, most likely during the reign of Harold Bluetooth. And after that, little. There is scant evidence of continuous use, and almost no sign of later occupation. Fires burned for a while, meals were cooked, animals were kept, but the rhythm of daily life never settled deeply into the soil. Soon, the hearths went cold, the houses began to sag, and grass crept over the roads. Within a generation, perhaps less, the circle was empty. Why would Harold, or any ruler, spend such enormous resources on projects that lasted so briefly? Some believe the forts were tied to specific political needs of the moment. Harold's reign was marked by wars and by the struggle to unify a kingdom. Perhaps these forts were built as a show of force, a network of power that proved the reach of the crown. Once his position was secure, the need for them faded, and they were left behind. In this view, the forts are like messages written in earth and timber, meant for a particular time, not for eternity. They achieved their purpose, and once that purpose was fulfilled, they could be abandoned without regret. Others suggest that the short lives of the forts point to a failure. Maybe Harold's vision overreached. Perhaps he sought to impose a new order on his people, to discipline warriors, to centralize power in ways the society was not ready to accept. The forts may have been symbols of a kingship that was too heavy, too foreign, too demanding. If the people did not embrace them, if the structures did not fit the rhythms of life, then their silence may record resistance as much as success. The perfect circles would then stand not as triumphs, but as reminders of an experiment that did not endure. Natural forces may also have played a role. The timber ramparts required maintenance. The thatched roofs of the houses needed care. Without constant attention, decay set in quickly. If the forts were not loved, not inhabited with daily devotion, they would have fallen apart within years. Mud would erode ditches, wood would rot, roofs would collapse. Their short lives may not be entirely intentional, but simply the result of neglect. A place without people becomes ruin almost overnight, especially in the damp winds of the north. There is also the possibility that their brief use was ritual by design. Like certain temples that were only ever meant to serve for a season, the forts may have been bound to a specific moment in myth or politics. Once that moment passed, they no longer had meaning. Their silence then becomes part of their story. They were never supposed to endure, but to blaze briefly in the world and vanish, leaving memory rather than permanence. This would align with the Viking worldview, where fate and ephemerality were central, where even the gods themselves were destined to fall at Ragnarok. A fort that lived only for a handful of years might have seemed less strange to them than it does to us. Whatever the reason, the feeling one gets when walking their grassy rings today is that of ghosts. The ramparts are too grand to be accidental, yet too quiet to be truly alive. The roads lead to gates that open into emptiness. The longhouses stretch as outlines in the soil, their doorways leading nowhere. The silence feels deliberate, as though the builders walked away with intent, leaving us to wonder. The forts almost seem to resist our attempts to assign them permanent roles. They were built, they were used briefly, and then they were gone. That transience may itself be the message, though we are left to guess at what it means. The short lives of the forts remind us of the fragility of power. Kings can command armies, raise monuments, and carve their names in runes, but time can undo them in the span of a breath. What seemed solid and permanent to Harold crumbled within years, leaving behind only earthworks and questions. That we still puzzle over them 1,000 years later shows that their silence is more enduring than their presence ever was. Perhaps this was not failure but success of another kind, a fleeting act that continues to echo across the centuries. If there is one figure who stands at the heart of the mystery of the Viking ring forts, it is Harold Bluetooth, the king whose name is etched into both stone and memory. To speak of these perfect circles without speaking of him would be to leave their story half told, for almost every clue we have points back to his reign. The tree rings of the timbers date to his years of power. The spread of the forts matches the extent of his influence, and their sudden appearance aligns with his moment on the throne. In their silent geometry, we can still glimpse the shadow of a king who sought not only to rule but to shape a people and a land in ways no ruler before him had dared. Harold was no ordinary warlord. He inherited power in a time when Denmark was fractured, its regions bound more by custom and clan than by crown. To unite such a place required more than swords. It required vision. Harold seems to have had that vision, and the ring forts are perhaps its clearest expression. By stamping the landscape with vast circles, each tied to his authority, he was doing more than building defenses. He was inscribing his presence into the very soil, leaving marks that declared his reign across a kingdom that had never known such centralized power. Each fort was a statement. Here is the reach of the king, here is the order of Harold, here is the circle that binds you to him. His role also emerges when we remember his place in the shifting world of faith. Harold is remembered as the king who Christianized Denmark, raising the great gelling stone that proclaims in runes that he made the Danes Christian. To do this was no small thing. It required both force and persuasion, both sword and symbol. The ring forts may have been part of this campaign. Their precise order, their 4 gates forming a cross, their monumental presence, all of these could have carried Christian undertones, marking a break from the old, uneven patterns of life and echoing the symmetry of a new faith. If so, Harold was not only building fortresses but also churches in earth, circles that preached the power of a god as well as the power of a king. Yet Harold was still a Viking, and his world was still one of battle and shifting loyalties. The forts may also reflect his role as a war leader, securing key points of the kingdom against enemies from within and without. He fought with the Germans to the south, with Norwegians to the north, with his own kin at home. In such a world, strongholds were not luxuries but necessities. By raising forts that could house troops, oversee trade routes, and dominate landscapes, Harold was anchoring his rule in timber and clay. His role was that of strategist as much as visionary, and the forts show us his hand at work. And yet, for all their grandeur, they also reveal his limits. For the forts lived only briefly, and their silence suggests that Harold's grip was not as firm as he hoped. His reign ended not in triumph but in exile, driven out by his own son, Sweyn Forkbeard. It is tempting to see the fate of the forts as bound to his fate. When he fell, they fell with him, their circles emptying as if their lifeblood had been tied to the man himself. The brevity of their lives may reflect the fragility of his grand project, the difficulty of holding together a kingdom by force of will alone. Still, his mark endures. To walk the ramparts today is to walk in the footsteps of Harold Bluetooth, to feel the sweep of his ambition in the curve of the earth. Though the forts are silent, they speak of a king who dreamed on a scale few of his age dared to dream. He was more than a warrior. He was a builder of symbols, a weaver of order, a ruler who tried to leave behind not just victories but monuments that declared the shape of his rule. If they did not endure in life, they endure in memory, and in that sense, Harold's role was fulfilled. We remember his name today not only because of the runes carved in stone, but because of the circles he left on the land. The modern world may know him best through a wireless technology that bears his name, but in truth his Raol signal lies in the earthworks that still puzzle and inspire us. The ring forts are his silent message across 1,000 years, a reminder that one man once sought to bind a people, a faith, and a kingdom into a perfect shape. Whether he succeeded or failed depends on how we judge, but there is no question that his role was central, his hand unmistakable, his ambition carved into the ground in circles too vast to ignore. The ring forts were not placed at random. When one studies their positions on the map, a pattern begins to emerge, though it is not a simple one. They appear spread across Denmark, each one separated by distances that seem carefully measured, as if the land itself had been surveyed and divided with purpose. From Trelleborg on the island of Zealand, to Furkut in Jutland, to Aggersborg on the Limfjord, they form a chain of circles that together outline a kingdom. The choice of their sites is as much a part of their mystery as their shape, for each fort stands in a place that mattered, a place that tied Harold Bluetooth's rule to the geography of his realm. Trelleborg lies near the western coast of Zealand, close to the Great Belt, a waterway that connects the Baltic Sea with the Kattegat. This was a vital corridor, a place where ships passed on their way to trade, raid, or fight. To hold such a position was to hold the throat of the kingdom. Furkut sits near the road between Jutland and the sea, a land route as important as any harbour. Aggersborg, the largest of them all, rises beside the Limfjord, a channel that once cut across Jutland and offered ships a shortcut from one coast to the other. Whoever commanded that waterway commanded the flow of goods, warriors, and wealth across the region. Even the smaller forts were placed with the same deliberate eye. Non-Nibakan in Odense lies near a river crossing, controlling movement deep into the island of Funen. Borgring, discovered only recently, sits close to the Kobe Bay, guarding an inlet that would have been a key landing spot for ships. These locations were not chosen for their beauty or isolation, but for their strategic weight. Harold's builders were placing anchors at the hinges of the land, securing trade routes, river mouths, fjords, and crossroads. The forts were like nails driven into the map, pinning the kingdom together. And yet their positions are not only military. They also reflect the symbolic geography of Denmark. By scattering them across different regions, Harold may have been sending a message of unity. No part of the land was left untouched by his circle. Each major region had its ring, each could see with its own eyes the mark of the king. It was as if he was weaving the country into a net of geometry, binding disparate lands into a single pattern. In this way, the forts were less about defending against an enemy than about declaring a new kind of order, one that stretched across fields, rivers, and seas. The landscape itself shaped how these forts lived. Built on slight rises, they commanded wide views of the surrounding countryside. From their ramparts one could look out and see far across farmland and water. They were not hidden places, but open, visible statements. A traveller approaching by road or river would see their circular outline and know at once that this was no ordinary settlement. The land was chosen so that the forts could not be ignored. They were as much monuments to be seen as fortresses to be used. Still, their placement also raises questions. If they were meant as strongholds, why are some so far from likely battlefronts? If they were meant as royal centres, why are they not closer to established towns? Their locations both make sense and defy it. They are practical in one light, symbolic in another. This tension lies at the heart of their mystery. The forts seem to belong both to strategy and to ritual, both to war and to show. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Harold meant them to operate on several levels at once, practical and spiritual, military and political. The landscape gave him the canvas, and he drew circles that could be read in more than one way. The soil beneath them adds another layer to their story. Excavations show traces of older settlements nearby, places that had long histories before Harold's builders arrived. In some cases, the forts were raised almost on top of earlier farms or villages, as if deliberately overwriting the past. This suggests a conscious choice, not just to build where it was convenient, but to impose new order over old patterns. To stand inside one of these circles was to stand inside a rewriting of the land's story. The ring forts thus became not just part of the landscape, but a statement about its control. Walking among their remains today, the surrounding scenery still speaks. At Aggersborg, the Limfjord stretches wide and shimmering, and one can almost see the sails of longships that once glided through. At Furkut, the gentle hills of Jutland roll away, dotted with farms that echo the lives once lived inside the circle. At Trelleborg, the damp air from the belt carries the smell of the sea, reminding us that water routes were lifelines. The forts are not ruins apart from their land, but still part of it, inseparable from the rivers, roads, and horizons that shaped their meaning. The landscape and location of the Viking ring forts show us that they were more than walls of timber and earth. They were deliberate acts of geography, choices that tied politics to place. In their placement we can see Harold Bluetooth's attempt to bind a kingdom not just through people or faith, but through the very shape of the land itself. To understand them fully is to read not only their circles, but the rivers, coasts, and fields they command. And it is there, in the meeting of earth and ambition, that the true depth of their mystery still lingers. When we think of the Vikings, it is easy to picture warriors swinging axes, ships cutting through stormy seas, and raids that shook the coasts of Europe. Yet the ring forts remind us that they were also builders of extraordinary skill, men and women whose hands shaped wood and earth into forms that still inspire awe. The people who raised these perfect circles were not rough amateurs working with whatever they had at hand. They were craftsmen, engineers, and laborers who understood measure, weight, and balance. To build such vast and flawless structures required not only strength but knowledge, and it is in this hidden knowledge that their genius lies. The scale of the task alone is staggering. Each fort was a circle hundreds of feet across, its ramparts piled high with earth and timber, its gates aligned with a precision that even modern surveyors marvel at. To lay out a perfect circle on such a scale without metal tools or advanced instruments would have demanded careful planning and practiced technique. The builders likely used ropes, posts, and sight lines, creating geometries on the ground before raising the walls. That they achieved such perfection again and again shows that this was not chance but mastery. Each fort proves that the Vikings knew more about design and measurement than we often give them credit for. The woodwork itself was a marvel. Great oak timbers formed the framework of the gates, fitted together with joinery that has lasted for centuries beneath the soil. Houses inside the forts were set in strict order, their walls and roofs aligned along the lines of the circle. Excavations reveal the remains of posts and planks carefully shaped by axes, smoothed and set with care. These were not crude huts, but strong and orderly buildings, built to a standard design that was repeated in fort after fort. Such repetition speaks of architects or overseers who guided the work, ensuring that each fort followed the same plan. But it was not only the design that shows their skill. It was also the speed. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, suggests that the forts were built within a very short span of time, perhaps just a few years. This means that massive labor forces must have been gathered and directed with great efficiency. Trees were felled, timbers cut, earth moved, posts set, and walls raised at a pace that must have transformed landscapes almost overnight. To manage such projects required organization on a scale rarely seen in the Viking world. It was as if an entire kingdom was mobilized to carve circles into the land. The craftsmanship also reflects a blending of traditions. The Vikings were master shipbuilders, and many of the skills used in carving keels and shaping hulls found new expression in the forts. The precise joinery, the careful shaping of timbers, the knowledge of weight and balance, all these echo the techniques used in shipyards. Just as their longships carried them across the seas, their carpentry carried their vision onto the land. One can imagine shipwrights lending their talents to royal projects, transferring their art from curved hulls to curved walls. In this sense, the forts are as much an expression of the Viking maritime tradition as their legendary vessels. We cannot forget the ordinary hands that did the labor. Behind every circle of earth and timber were countless workers digging trenches, carrying logs, driving stakes, and piling soil. These were farmers, craftsmen, and thralls, bound together in a massive effort that left little time for other tasks. To be summoned to work on a fort was to be pulled into the service of the king's vision. Their sweat soaked into the earth, their backs bent under the weight of timber, their footprints pressed paths across the circles. Though their names are lost, their labor still speaks through every curve of the ramparts. And yet, for all the labor, the forts were not crude. They carry a sense of beauty in their symmetry, a grace in their proportions. To walk their outlines is to feel a rhythm, as if the builders cared not only for strength but also for harmony. This balance between function and form suggests that the builders were more than practical men. They were artists in their own right, shaping landscapes into patterns that still move us. They worked with wood and soil, but what they created was as much art as architecture. It is worth remembering that these builders lived in a world without blueprints or machines. Every measurement was made by hand, every timber cut by axe, every load of soil carried by muscle. And yet the results rival anything from more famous civilizations. While the Romans left stone and the Egyptians raised pyramids, the Vikings built in wood and earth, materials more fragile and fleeting. That so much still survives beneath the soil is a testament to how well they built, and to the enduring power of their craft. The ring forts remind us that Viking society was more complex than legend suggests. Behind the warriors were builders, behind the raids were projects of peace, behind the chaos of battle was a capacity for order. The craftsmanship of the forts stands as proof of this deeper truth. The men and women who built them may not have thought of themselves as leaving monuments, but in their circles of earth they left behind a story of skill, ambition, and artistry that still speaks across 1,000 years. When the circle was complete, when the timbers were raised and the ramparts stood firm, the question remained: who lived within these strange and perfect walls? The answer is not simple, for the forts do not tell their story easily. What survives are the faint traces of lives once lived: post holes where houses stood, shards of pottery, animal bones, broken tools, the ashes of hearth fires long gone cold. From these fragments archaeologists piece together a picture of daily life, though it is blurred and incomplete, like trying to hear voices from across a foggy field. Yet even in these faint echoes, the forts reveal something remarkable about the people who called them home. Inside the ramparts stood neat rows of longhouses, each placed with mathematical precision, facing the central crossroads that divided the circle into quarters. Unlike villages that grew slowly and unevenly, with houses scattered at random, the forts were ordered from the beginning. Each longhouse was nearly the same size, suggesting that no one family or clan dominated the space. This equal arrangement hints at a society inside that was less about individual status and more about collective purpose. These were not the homes of free farmers living as they pleased, but houses for people gathered under a common command, perhaps warriors, craftsmen, or retainers serving the king. The longhouses themselves were built in the familiar Viking style, with wooden frames, walls of planks or wattle, and thatched roofs. Within them, life would have carried the same rhythms as any household of the age. Fires burned at the center, smoke curling upward to escape through the roof. Families or groups sat along the benches at the sides, eating from wooden bowls, sharpening tools, mending clothes. Children played with carved toys or chased each other across the dirt floors, their laughter mixing with the gruff talk of adults. Dogs and livestock may have shared the space, their presence a reminder that even in these great circles, life remained tied to the land. Food was prepared and shared communally. Bones from cattle, pigs, sheep, and fish show that meals were varied, though always simple. Bread baked from coarse grain, stews of meat and vegetables, fish roasted over the fire. Such meals sustained the people who lived within the walls. And yet, there is evidence of feasting too. Large pits filled with bones suggest that at times the community gathered for celebrations, where ale flowed and the tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat. These moments would have turned the forts from places of order into places of joy, with songs echoing off the wooden walls and stories told deep into the night. Craftsmen were surely present as well. Fragments of tools and objects found within the forts show that metal was worked, wood was carved, textiles were woven, and leather was shaped. The forts may have served as centers of production, where skilled hands created what the wider kingdom needed. One can imagine the clang of hammers on iron, the rasp of saws through timber, the rhythmic thump of looms as cloth was woven. These sounds filled the air alongside the voices of those who labored, creating a constant hum of activity within the ordered space. But life inside the forts was not only about work and meals. It was also about discipline. The very design of the forts suggests a community living under strict control. To rise in the morning was to follow a rhythm set not by the seasons alone, but by the demands of those in charge. If the forts housed warriors, then their days would have been filled with training, drilling in the fields outside the gates, practicing the shield wall or honing their weapons. If they housed the king's men and administrators, then their lives would have been filled with tasks of governance, collecting tribute, managing supplies, or preparing orders. Whatever their roles, the people inside lived lives shaped by order more than freedom. And yet, even under such control, human lives carried on. Couples formed, children were born, friendships were forged around the hearths. The forts may have been built for the king's vision, but they were sustained by ordinary people with their own hopes, fears, and joys. They gossiped, they laughed, they argued, they mourned. The same emotions that filled any village filled the ring forts too, though enclosed by ramparts that marked their lives as different from those outside. It is possible that the forts were not meant for permanent living, but for gathering at certain times, seasons of training, moments of ritual, times of war. If so, then life inside them may have been intense but temporary, marked by bursts of activity followed by abandonment. The traces left behind could be the remnants of such short-lived occupations, people coming together under the king's order and then dispersing back to their farms. This rhythm would explain why the forts feel both full of life and strangely empty at the same time. The mystery of who lived inside remains one of the most tantalizing questions. Were they elite warriors sworn to the king? Were they craftsmen and workers bound to his service? Were they families relocated from their farms to serve a higher purpose? The evidence whispers but does not shout. And so we are left with images half seen, a ring of houses filled with smoke and laughter, the sound of axes and hammers, the smell of roasting meat, the weight of discipline and command. What is certain is that life inside the forts was unlike life in any ordinary village. These were places apart, created with purpose, filled with people whose lives were drawn into the orbit of power. To walk inside them now, where only the outlines of the houses remain, is to imagine a world of noise and movement, of community and control, of work and celebration. The ring forts were not only walls and ramparts. They were lived-in spaces, filled with the pulse of human life. And though their voices are faint, they still echo across the centuries, carried by the circle of earth that held them. The ring forts stand in silence today, their grassy mounds traced only by the wind and the footsteps of curious visitors, but when they were first built they carried a different weight. They were not raised for beauty alone, nor for the idle whims of kings. They were defenses, strongholds of timber and earth meant to withstand the dangers of their time. Behind their symmetry and order lies a truth about the Viking world, that it was never safe, never still, never free from enemies and threats pressing against its edges. To understand why such immense effort was poured into perfect circles of protection, we must turn to the dangers that shadowed the age. The Vikings themselves were raiders, feared across seas and rivers. Yet even the fiercest raiders feared attack. For every village they struck abroad, there were neighbors ready to strike back at home. Rival chieftains sought advantage, kings clashed for power, and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. A fort was not only a defense against foreign armies, but against one's own kin turned enemies. The ring forts may have been raised to secure a fragile kingdom from its own internal strife, a warning to those who might dream of rebellion. Within their walls a king could gather loyal men, safe from sudden ambush, able to project authority outward in all directions. Beyond internal rivals lay the looming powers to the south. The Holy Roman Empire, under kings and emperors who sought to expand their reach northward, cast a long shadow. Armies of trained soldiers marched under banners of the cross, armed with heavy cavalry and siege engines unknown in Scandinavia. To a Viking ruler, these foreign forces would have seemed a storm gathering at the horizon. A ring fort could act as a bulwark, a place to resist or at least slow the advance of such disciplined might. Some historians believe the forts were built in direct response to these continental threats, a hurried attempt to prepare for invasions that never fully came but were always feared. Closer to home, there were also the Slavic tribes to the east, strong in number and fierce in defense of their lands. They were no strangers to conflict with the Danes, and the memory of raids and counter-raids lingered on both sides. The forts, some placed near borders or along routes of travel, may have been set to watch these frontiers, to stand ready should enemies come pouring across rivers or coasts. From their gates, warriors could march out in force, and if pressed, retreat into walls designed to hold the line. But the threats were not only foreign armies or hostile tribes. The Viking world was alive with smaller dangers, bands of raiders, sudden attacks by neighbors, unrest among the people themselves. In an age without standing armies or permanent garrisons, a king needed places where order could be imposed quickly, where strength could be concentrated. The forts answered this need. To look upon their precise design is to see not only beauty but also control, the control of fear into form, the shaping of chaos into a circle meant to endure. Inside their walls, people must have felt both safety and unease. The high ramparts promised shelter, but their very existence reminded all who entered that enemies were near. Every gate, carefully aligned and guarded, marked the line between security and danger. The sight of spears stacked by the houses, the sound of men drilling in the yards, the readiness of stores of food and weapons, all spoke of a life lived under constant awareness that an enemy could come at any time. The forts were places of waiting as much as of living, places where threat was never forgotten but kept at bay by wood, earth, and discipline. We cannot know exactly who the king feared most when he ordered these circles raised. Perhaps it was a rival within his own bloodline, eager to seize the crown. Perhaps it was the empire to the south, whose missionaries and armies pressed ever closer. Perhaps it was simply the uncertainty of a world where power was always fragile, where loyalty was won and lost with gifts, where no kingdom was secure for long. The forts, in their silent perfection, seem almost to reflect that uncertainty, as if they were not just walls against enemies, but answers to fear itself. And yet, for all their strength, the forts never saw the great sieges they were built to resist. There are no records of battles fought at their gates, no tales of desperate defenses, no sagas of walls falling under fire. They seem to have stood ready for wars that never came, their ramparts waiting for enemies who never appeared. This silence deepens their mystery. Were they so imposing that they frightened enemies away? Or were they abandoned before they could serve their purpose? The truth is hidden, but the question lingers with every circle traced by the plough and the archaeologist's spade. Still, we can imagine the threats that filled the minds of their builders, the shadows that haunted their sleep. To live in the Viking Age was to live with danger as a constant companion, to know that safety was never certain. The ring forts were born from that reality, from the knowledge that enemies could rise from any direction. They were circles drawn against fear, shields of earth, and were meant to stand when men could not. Though their foes are long gone, their walls remain, reminders of a time when threats shaped stone, timber, and soil into one of history's most enduring puzzles. The ring forts rise from the earth with such precision and such strength that one would expect them to have been used for centuries. Yet the greatest mystery is not how they were built, or who commanded them, but why they were abandoned so suddenly. For all their perfection, for all the labor poured into them, they did not last. Within a generation, perhaps even less, they were left behind. Fires went cold in their longhouses, gates swung open without guards, and weeds crept across their once ordered yards. This abrupt silence hangs over them like a question that refuses to be answered, a riddle carved into the soil itself. When archaeologists first studied them, they expected to find long histories hidden in the layers of earth, new houses built over old, signs of rebuilding after fire, traces of growth and change. Instead, what they uncovered was a kind of stillness. The layers were thin, the debris of daily life shallow. It was as though the people had lived there only briefly, perhaps no more than a decade or two, before walking away. The forts were not broken in battle or destroyed by fire. They were not toppled by storms or swallowed by flood. They were simply left, as if their purpose had dissolved overnight. Why such immense effort for so short a life? Some say the forts were tied to one king, perhaps Harold Bluetooth, whose ambition reshaped Denmark. If he ordered them, they may have lived only as long as his power endured. When he was gone, his successors may not have shared his vision, and the forts lost their meaning. Without royal will to sustain them, they fell silent, their houses empty, their walls untended. Power in the Viking world was bound to people, not to places, and once the living force behind the forts was gone, their circle could not hold. Others believe the forts were linked to threats that never came. Perhaps they were built in fear of invasion, a fear that faded when no armies arrived. Their builders may have expected war, but when peace held, the forts stood idle, monuments to caution rather than necessity. In such a restless world, idle monuments could not survive. People returned to their farms, to villages where life was freer, where fields could be tended without walls pressing in. A fort without a purpose is a hollow shell, and soon even the most perfect circle cannot resist the pull of abandonment. It is also possible that the forts were too strict, too controlled. Inside their walls life was ordered with a discipline unknown in ordinary villages. Houses were equal, space was measured, movements were confined. To live within them may have felt unnatural to a people used to freedom and wide horizons. They may have been places of command rather than community, built to impose rather than to nurture. And so, once the king's gaze shifted, those within may have seized the chance to leave, to return to the looser rhythms of farm and field. The walls that were meant to protect may have felt instead like barriers, and when the chance came, they walked away. There are signs, too, that some were abandoned in haste. At one fort, tools and objects were found as if left behind, not carefully stored away but simply dropped. At another, repairs that had begun were never finished, timbers left half set. Such clues suggest that the departure was not always gradual but sudden, a decision made quickly, perhaps under pressure. Yet no clear evidence points to enemies or disaster. It seems instead that the abandonment was a choice, deliberate but abrupt, like a torch snuffed out in the middle of a story. The silence of the ring forts after their use is haunting. Fields grew over them, cattle grazed across their circles, farmers ploughed through their ramparts. For centuries they lay forgotten, their great symmetry hidden under grass. To those who lived nearby, they may have seemed like ancient ruins even 100 years after they were left. Children likely played on their banks without knowing who had built them, while travelers wondered at the strange earthworks rising from the flat land. The memory of their purpose faded long before they were uncovered again by modern eyes. The sudden abandonment is perhaps the clearest sign that their meaning was tied to something we cannot yet see. They were not ordinary settlements that would grow and change with time. They were instruments, bound to a plan that did not last. When the plan ended, they ended too. That is why they confuse us still. They are not incomplete by accident, but by design, monuments to a vision that flickered briefly and then vanished. They force us to imagine the weight of choices made in their time, choices that can shape landscapes yet leave behind only silence. Today, when we walk their circles, it is this silence that speaks the loudest. We see not only the strength of their construction, but the fragility of their purpose. They remind us that even the most enduring walls cannot stand without the people who give them life. They were abandoned not because they failed as structures, but because they succeeded only as long as their vision held. Once that vision dimmed, the people turned away, and the earth reclaimed what remained. The sudden abandonment is not just an ending, but a lesson. It tells us that human power, however great, is fleeting, and that even the most perfect circles can vanish into the soil. The forts confuse us because they are both immense and fragile, lasting for 1,000 years yet alive for only a few. In their emptiness, they carry the weight of an unanswered question, one that hangs over every visitor who stands within their walls. Why build forever and then leave so soon? The Viking ring forts stand today as quiet scars on the land, their perfect circles visible from above like patterns pressed into the earth by some forgotten hand. They have long since lost their walls of timber, their gates, and the lives of the people who once walked within them. Yet what remains is more powerful than stone or wood. What remains is the mystery, the unanswered question of why they were built, why they were abandoned, and what they meant to those who shaped them. It is this mystery, as much as their form, that gives them their lasting legacy. For historians, they are puzzles that refuse to be solved. Every excavation uncovers more detail: the width of a wall, the placement of a house, the charred remains of a fire, but each detail only deepens the question. The symmetry of the forts speaks of design, of purpose, of a mind that planned with care, but the purpose itself slips through our fingers like sand. Were they military camps, training grounds, royal statements of power, or religious symbols drawn on a massive scale? Each possibility seems strong and yet incomplete, and so the debate continues, generation after generation, with no final answer. The forts have become timeless classrooms for the study of human ambition, where every new theory reflects more about our own need for meaning than about the past itself. For those who visit, the forts stir a different kind of wonder. Standing in the center of a circle that stretches in flawless arcs around you, it is easy to feel the weight of time pressing close. The grass grows soft over the ramparts, birds wheel above, the wind moves without resistance, and yet there is a sense that you are not alone. You feel the presence of those who once raised the walls, the echo of shouts and footsteps, the rhythm of axes biting into wood. The air seems thick with memory, and though no one can tell you why the place exists, you know it mattered deeply to someone long ago. That feeling, more than any explanation, is the legacy the forts give to the living, the reminder that the past is not just facts but experiences, emotions, and mysteries too vast to be pinned down. The forts also carry a legacy of humility. They remind us that even the grandest human projects can fade quickly, and that what survives is not always what was intended. The people who built them could not have imagined they would one day stand empty, their purpose forgotten, visited by strangers who could only guess at their meaning. Yet here they are, their circles enduring when the names of their builders do not. They teach us that history is not always a story of triumph, but often one of questions, that sometimes the most enduring monuments are those that defy explanation. In the lands where they rise, they have become symbols of heritage. They appear in books, in school lessons, in the imagination of children who walk their ramparts and dream of warriors and kings. They are used to tell stories about identity, about what it meant to be part of a world that was fierce, uncertain, and full of wonder. They remind people that the soil beneath their feet carries not only crops and stones, but also memories, shaped by hands long gone. To live near a fort is to live near a riddle that has lasted 1,000 years, a constant reminder that the past is alive in the ground. And yet, perhaps the greatest legacy of all is that they still make us ask questions. In a world where so much is explained, where science and history press ever closer to certainty, the forts remain defiant. They whisper that not everything can be solved, that some truths may be beyond reach. This is not a failure of knowledge, but a gift. It keeps us searching, keeps us curious, keeps us humble. They show us that mystery itself can endure, that not knowing is sometimes as powerful as knowing. The forts hold their silence like a treasure, and in doing so, they give us something no other ruins can: the chance to imagine, to wonder, to keep the past alive in our own minds. The ring forts will likely never reveal their secrets fully. They will remain what they have always been: circles of earth and timber, too perfect to be dismissed, too silent to be explained. And that is why they matter. Their legacy is not just the grass-grown ramparts we can walk today, but the enduring sense of awe they inspire. They are monuments not only to the Vikings, but to the very nature of history, which is never complete, never closed, always full of echoes and questions. As long as they stand, they will continue to confuse, to fascinate, to invite us to stand in their circles and listen to the silence. In that silence lies their true gift. It is the sound of time itself, reminding us that all human works, no matter how strong, are fleeting, but that mystery can last forever. The forts may have been abandoned, but in being abandoned they became immortal. Their legacy is not power or victory, but wonder, the kind of wonder that keeps the past alive in every generation that gazes upon their circles and feels the need to ask, once more, why?